November 1944, early morning skies over Berlin. The city lay under a quiet tension that betrayed the storm to come. Luftwaffe pilots, perched in their cockpits at various airfields ringing the capital, felt a familiar thrill, but this time it carried a shadow of dread. Intelligence briefings had warned them of the long-range P-51 Mustangs escorting the Allied bombers, but no report could fully capture what it meant to see the aircraft slicing through the cold, steel-colored morning sky, engines singing with precision and endurance. They were faster, leaner, and yet somehow heavier in presence, a paradox that spoke of American industrial might. Fuel, once a lifeline of strategic control, no longer promised security. Berlin itself now sat exposed under an enemy sky. The first Mustang formations appeared just as the dawn sun caught the rooftops, their polished aluminum glinting even beneath camouflaged markings. Pilots strained through goggles and binoculars, noting the sheer endurance of these fighters, how they escorted bombers with unflinching consistency, and how their presence defied the Luftwaffe's previous calculations. Gone were the days when German fighters could dominate the airspace above their own cities. The speed and range of the P-51s turned defensive strategy into a nightmare. Every sortie the Luftwaffe scrambled to intercept required precise fuel calculations. But even perfect planning could not negate the fact that the Americans were now operating deep into German airspace with near impunity. At the briefing rooms, Luftwaffe officers pored over maps and flight logs. The numbers told a story of attrition, of pilots being stretched too thin, of engines running past safe operational limits. Göring, observing from his command post, realized that fuel scarcity was no longer a limiting factor for the enemy, it was a limiting factor for Germany. Even the most seasoned aces felt the anxiety as they prepared to engage. The P-51s did not just arrive to intercept German fighters, they arrived to expose systemic vulnerabilities, to highlight a failure in logistics and foresight. Each pilot knew that any engagement was now a race not only against enemy fire but against dwindling resources. As the first exchanges began, the Luftwaffe pilots were forced into reactive maneuvers, their familiar tactical patterns disrupted by the sheer reach of the Mustangs. The P-51s maintained formation over bomber streams with flawless coordination, their fuel capacity allowing continuous coverage far beyond previous limits. German fighters attempted interception, climbing into altitude bands with engines straining, yet the Mustang seemed always positioned perfectly, as if anticipating each move. Fuel gauges were checked obsessively. Every decision about altitude, throttle, and engagement had a hidden calculus. One misstep meant returning to base with insufficient reserves, or worse, ditching over hostile territory. The pilots could no longer rely on their own airspace as a safety net. Beyond the technical considerations, the psychological impact was profound. Veteran pilots, once confident in their ability to control engagements over German cities, found themselves facing not only a superior aircraft in terms of operational reach but also a force that had mastered the industrial game. Each Mustang lost in combat was quickly replaced. Each sortie completed by Allied forces only reinforced the impression that Germany's advantage was slipping irreversibly. Reports from the field circulated quickly. A wingman lost in fuel miscalculation, another forced to land in unfamiliar territory. The P-51s did not merely challenge tactics. They challenged the assumption that German air power could secure the Reich indefinitely. The air over Berlin that morning was a tapestry of tension and revelation. The silver sheen of the Mustangs, combined with their coordinated precision, created a stark visual contrast to the darker, older Luftwaffe models. Pilots remarked to one another that the American fighters moved with a quiet confidence, a relentless rhythm, almost machine-like in their efficiency. Here was a design philosophy that prioritized sustained operational performance over mere acrobatic excellence. Whereas German fighters had been optimized for peak agility and speed, the Mustangs operated for endurance and consistency. Every pilot who witnessed this knew instinctively that the old metrics of success, climbing rate, turn radius, short-range burst power, were no longer sufficient measures of superiority. November 1944. Late morning. The sky over Berlin was no longer just a canvas for dogfights. It had become a stage for logistical revelation. Luftwaffe pilots scrambled repeatedly, racing to positions that, minutes before, had seemed secure. Each takeoff felt heavier than the last, not because of aircraft weight, but because of the awareness that fuel calculations, once routine, now bore the weight of existential consequence. Engines roared in rhythm with the tension, as if acknowledging the invisible clock counting down against them. Pilots could sense it. The Reich's defenses were stretched to their absolute limits, and the P-51s above were an unyielding measure of that strain. Intercepting the Mustangs required precision unlike anything these pilots had faced in years. Their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs climbed aggressively, weaving through clouds, banking sharply to position themselves for attack. Yet, no matter how meticulously they maneuvered, the Mustangs maintained escort positions with uncanny consistency. Fuel gauges ticked toward red zones. Sweat collected inside helmets. Instruments seemed suddenly alive, whispering warnings. One misjudged climb or prolonged pursuit meant being stranded miles from home. Every Luftwaffe pilot understood that, for the first time, air combat was less about skill and more about endurance, logistics, and timing, arenas in which the Americans now excelled. Reports from earlier sorties painted a grim picture. Pilots recounted engagements where fuel exhaustion forced aborted attacks, others where aircraft were barely able to limp back to base. Even the most experienced aces noticed an uncomfortable pattern. The Americans were operating at a tempo that Germany simply could not match. It was not that the P-51s were invincible. German pilots could still achieve victories in skirmishes. The problem was cumulative. Each success was fleeting, each sortie a drop in a growing deficit. By mid-morning, the scale of the mismatch was undeniable. The Reich could no longer guarantee the safety of its cities from sustained air assault. From the ground, controllers tracked the ebb and flow of dogfights. The radio crackled constantly, pilots reporting positions, damages, fuel levels, and enemy maneuvers. Long-range P-51s allowed American bomber formations to penetrate previously secure zones, while German fighters consumed precious fuel in repeated interception attempts. Some pilots attempted daring low-level attacks, trying to force Mustangs into energy-draining maneuvers. Yet the P-51s, built with endurance as a core principle, simply absorbed these tactics, their operational design allowing them to sustain course, altitude, and position long after German fighters were forced to descend or turn back. Amid the chaos, some veteran Luftwaffe pilots began to articulate the hard truth aloud. Performance alone no longer defined superiority. A Messerschmitt could outmaneuver a Mustang in a tight turn, but that advantage evaporated when fuel ran low or when multiple sorties had to be flown in rapid succession. Operational availability. How many aircraft could actually fly, day after day, without mechanical failure or exhaustion of resources, had emerged as the decisive factor. The Americans had not just engineered an exceptional fighter, they had engineered a war-winning system. Each Mustang represented not just a machine, but the strategic foresight of an industrial apparatus capable of sustaining prolonged pressure. The realization hit pilots with a mix of awe and dread. Even with perfect skill, their own fighters were being rendered less effective simply because they could not endure the operational demands of the conflict. By midday, reports reached high command that entire squadrons were running dangerously low on fuel, with some forced to turn back before engagement. Göring, watching from his command post, understood what his pilots could not fully admit. The Reich skies were no longer a domain of control. Each long-range Mustang sortie symbolized the shrinking gap between German ambition and capability. The Luftwaffe's once formidable fighters were being measured not against isolated engagements but against the relentless capacity of American production and operational planning. It was a silent but devastating metric. Germany could win individual battles, but sustaining those victories day after day was becoming impossible. Pilots returning from sorties recounted another striking detail. Mustangs, even when engaged or damaged, demonstrated an unusual robustness. Aircraft that had been hit often managed to maintain formation or return to friendly territory, a testament not just to skillful flying but to durable construction and maintenance systems designed for consistency. By contrast, German fighters, subjected to repeated flights under wartime pressures, began showing signs of wear and variability in performance. Engines strained, landing gear weakened, and minor damage often rendered aircraft non-operational until repaired, if at all. The Americans were not producing superior pilots. They were producing pilots and aircraft in a system that maximized sustained effectiveness. The contrast was now painfully evident. The psychological impact was equally significant. Pilots whispered among themselves that the Mustangs were like ghosts, always present, always efficient, never faltering. Each encounter reinforced the sense that fuel scarcity, maintenance limitations, and operational fatigue were no longer abstract concerns but active strategic disadvantages. As the day progressed, Luftwaffe officers convened to adjust plans, attempting to anticipate the unrelenting rhythm of American sorties. Even with clever tactics, The operational ceiling of the German Air Force was being systematically tested. Each missed opportunity, each aborted interception, each forced retreat underscored the stark reality. The Reich had lost not only air superiority but the systemic ability to contest it consistently. By afternoon, the first grim calculations began circulating among commanders. Fuel reserves, once sufficient for multiple sorties, were now barely adequate for single engagements. Aircraft maintenance could not keep pace with sorties, and pilot endurance was fraying under continuous pressure. The P-51s were not just machines. They were catalysts, exposing the vulnerabilities that had long been ignored in the Luftwaffe's operational philosophy. Senior officers realized that the war over Germany was no longer measured by individual heroics in the air, but by the ability to sustain consistent, repeatable, and reliable combat operations, a category in which the Reich was now failing. As dusk approached, pilots returned to their bases, exhausted, engines idling, minds racing. Reports were filed, calculations double-checked, and strategy discussions continued late into the evening. The pattern of the day had made one thing painfully clear: the Luftwaffe could no longer guarantee the defense of its skies. Fuel shortages, maintenance limitations, and the relentless operational capacity of the P-51s had combined into a decisive strategic disadvantage. For the first time, many pilots understood that they were not just fighting aircraft in the sky. They were fighting a system, a philosophy, and an industrial machine that Germany could not match. The realization, bitter as it was, settled over Berlin like a shadow, marking the beginning of a fundamental shift in the air war. Late November 1944. The skies above Berlin had become an unyielding theater of tension. Pilots returned from sorties with aircraft showing signs of fatigue, oil stains, dented panels, strained engines. It was not only battle damage that weighed on them, but the cumulative effect of relentless operational tempo. Each day, the P-51s maintained a rhythm that the Luftwaffe could not match. One squadron lost an aircraft to mechanical failure. Another returned with engines running low on oil after repeated climbs. The realization was settling in slowly, painfully. Skill, courage, and traditional mastery no longer guaranteed dominance. The Americans were winning not through brilliance in individual dogfights but through endurance, planning, and industrial consistency. Göring, pacing his office, reviewed reports that had begun to arrive in increasing frequency. They told a story far different from the heroic narratives he preferred. Long-range P-51 escorts had rendered previous defensive calculations obsolete, and the Luftwaffe's numbers were dwindling in operational effectiveness, if not on paper. Pilots were fatigued, aircraft were worn, fuel was scarce. What he had dismissed as a temporary logistical inconvenience had become a strategic inevitability. The Reich, long confident in its ability to protect the skies over its capital, was no longer in control. And yet, the reports also revealed the Americans' silent advantage. They were operating within a system designed to sustain war over months, not weeks, ensuring that each Mustang could return, refuel, and fly again while German aircraft increasingly failed to meet the demands of continuous engagement. From the perspective of individual pilots, the shift was both technical and existential. Veteran aces who had once relied on precise maneuvers and intimate knowledge of their aircraft were now forced to reconsider their assumptions. The P-51s, flying efficiently at high altitude, could maintain escort formations far longer than German fighters could endure. The differences in design philosophy became painfully clear. German fighters demanded peak performance from pilots and machines alike, rewarding skill but punishing error. The Americans had built machines for operational reliability, forgiving human error, mechanical variation, and the pressures of sustained missions. Each day in the air became a calculus of endurance and preservation, not just combat prowess. By early December, the systemic consequences were undeniable. German pilots reported that bomber streams penetrated deeper into the Reich with fewer losses than expected. Even successful interceptions often ended with German fighters stranded on low fuel, forced to land at auxiliary fields, or returning with engines stressed beyond optimal limits. Maintenance crews worked frantically, yet every repair seemed to expose another limitation. Parts shortages, inconsistent manufacturing, and inexperienced technicians compounded the problem. In contrast, American squadrons operated from well-supplied bases, their aircraft maintained under procedures designed to ensure maximum availability. The lesson, painfully clear, was that air combat was no longer measured by isolated brilliance but by the capacity to sustain operations reliably over time. The human toll mirrored the mechanical strain. Pilots spoke quietly among themselves, comparing notes about endurance, stress, and fear. Even seasoned veterans admitted that the relentless American sorties were eroding confidence. Where once Luftwaffe fighters had symbolized national pride and technical superiority, now they symbolized vulnerability. Reports circulated of engagements where Mustangs, though not invincible, could always be replaced, whereas German aircraft, once lost to mechanical failure or operational exhaustion, often could not return to service quickly enough to maintain defensive lines. Fuel scarcity, maintenance gaps, and operational fatigue converged into a cumulative disadvantage that individual heroics could not overcome. Göring's realization deepened as the weeks passed. The Reichsmarschall had long relied on the assumption that air superiority rested on German skill, advanced aircraft, and defensive doctrine. The P-51s shattered this notion. It was not merely the Mustang's performance that mattered, but the philosophy behind it, a combination of endurance, ease of maintenance, pilot-friendly systems, and industrial throughput that Germany could not replicate under wartime constraints. Every successful mission flown by the Americans highlighted the structural weaknesses of a Luftwaffe, forcing commanders to confront an uncomfortable truth. The war above Germany's cities was increasingly unwinnable. It was not lack of courage, nor tactical failure, but the very framework of operational design and production that dictated outcomes. By mid-December, the pattern of attrition became painfully evident in the operational statistics. Units that once boasted high availability found themselves grounded by mechanical issues or fuel shortages. Ersatz pilots, often rushed through training due to dwindling resources, struggled to meet the demands of high-tempo sorties. In contrast, American units fielded well-trained pilots flying aircraft that were not only durable but forgiving. Each P-51 sortie over Berlin demonstrated the multiplier effect of design philosophy. Reliability bred consistency, and consistency bred strategic dominance. Luftwaffe pilots began to understand, almost instinctively, that their previous calculations, based on aircraft agility, speed, and pilot skill, were now insufficient. Operational endurance was the decisive variable. On the ground, intelligence officers compiled reports describing repeated incursions deep into German airspace. Cities once thought secure faced sustained attacks with minimal resistance. Fuel depots and infrastructure were targeted, further compounding the Reich's inability to sustain operations. Pilots returning from missions noted with frustration that even successful engagements often ended in forced landings or extended maintenance. The Americans, meanwhile, operated with predictable efficiency. Aircraft returned from sorties with minimal downtime, crews rotated seamlessly, and replacements were always ready. Each day reinforced a lesson that would be recorded in pilot memoirs and intelligence briefings. The war above Germany was no longer a contest of skill but a demonstration of operational philosophy, logistics, and endurance. As winter deepened, Luftwaffe pilots reflected privately on what they had witnessed. The P-51s were not unbeatable. Skillful flying could still produce tactical victories. Yet the broader implications were unavoidable. Germany could not sustain the pace of engagements, the attrition of pilots and aircraft, nor the operational demands imposed by American endurance. Pilots began to question not only the aircraft they flew but the philosophy behind their deployment. Individual excellence, once celebrated, was insufficient to secure air dominance in a war defined by industrial capacity and operational resilience. The P-51s were a revelation, not superior in every metric of traditional dogfighting, but superior in war-winning design. By the end of December, the cumulative effect on morale and strategic planning was unmistakable. Commanders adjusted expectations downward. Sorties were rationed. Pilots were stretched thin, forced to fly under extreme pressure. Göring's reports, once confident, reflected resignation. Fuel scarcity, maintenance shortfalls, and industrial imbalance could no longer be ignored. The Luftwaffe's failure was systemic, and the P-51s had laid bare the fatal flaw. Germany's air strategy had relied on peak performance of both men and machines, without accounting for sustained operational demands. By contrast, the Americans had created an air force designed to endure, outlast, and overwhelm through persistent capability. Looking back from post-war memoirs, Luftwaffe pilots described those months over Berlin with a mix of awe and bitterness. The P-51 Mustang, relentless and efficient, symbolized more than enemy aircraft. It symbolized a philosophy of industrial and operational design that Germany could not match. Pilots recounted that even when engaging skillfully, success was fleeting. The lesson was profound and immutable. In sustained conflict, reliability, operational availability, and systemic foresight outweigh peak performance. The Americans had not simply built superior fighters. They had built a system capable of sustaining war in a way the Luftwaffe never could. Fuel, once a promise of safety, had become a measure of vulnerability, and Berlin, exposed beneath an unending stream of Mustangs, was the undeniable proof.